And I always try and follow my intuition. Like, I'm
Yeah.
not the kind of person who's like, oh, I will die rather than go to a hospital. Like, if I feel the need to go, I'll go.
Hmm.
But I'm not going to go out of fear because someone else tells me you can't do this.
Yeah.
And that perinatologist wagged his finger at me and said, don't you try and have these babies at home. And I hadn't even said I was planning it. I just said that I had two previous home births. And so he's just
Yeah.
like, don't even think about it. And I'm like, well, I am. I am thinking about it. And
Yeah.
I finally found like a birth attendant. So she wasn't a midwife, but she's a birth attendant. She's trained as a midwife, but not registered as a midwife.
Hmm.
And so I felt really confident with her. And she worked with a couple other ladies that were midwives. And so I had like a team of three and my husband and my mom. And I was like, okay, I feel totally confident having these babies at home. And again, it was amazing. It was pain-free. I had the first twin, Frank Breech.
Hey, you're listening to Empowered Births at Home with me, Esmeralda, the home birth doula, as your host. I am a mama of three, fellow home birther, and entrepreneur. I am completely obsessed with birth, more specifically, home birth. And this is a podcast where women share their empowering home birth stories, along with the journey that led them down the path to home birth. Whether you're currently pregnant, planning a home birth with your first or fourth baby, or even just someone who is a complete birth nerd like me, this is the podcast for you. So let's get into this week's empowering home birth story. We are on episode 31 today. We will be chatting with Kristi, who is a mother of 10 and has had experience in every kind of birth location. She has given birth in the hospital, in birth centers, and at home. And she has so much wisdom to share with us on preparing for a peaceful, pain-free birth. And I just absolutely loved this conversation with her. So I know you guys are going to love it as well. Let's go ahead and bring Kristi on.
Hey, so my name is Kristi Dugan. I'm a mom of 10. I hope to have a few
Wow.
more. We'll see how far I go, but I have had 9 births. My last was twins. So
Mm,
9 births, and my first two were hospital births. And I didn't learn about, like the whole world of natural birthing until my third. I started doing birth centers, and then my last three were home births. So it's been a journey for me. But yeah, I'm a homeschool mom, and I like to share with women that birth can be pain free, that it can be pleasurable, that it
mm,
doesn't have to be traumatic and scary, and that they can birth with confidence and without fear. And that's kind of my message for the world.
yeah. Wow, that's amazing. Having 10 children. I can't imagine, but it sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
Definitely. So, how did you get into the whole home birth world? Was it your births that kind of brought you into it?
Yeah. So my mom had 9 kids, all of them at the hospital. My first two were hospital births, and I had an epidural with the first one. Like, I was going to go all natural at the hospital, but the cascade of interventions, and I ended up having an epidural, and it didn't work. Like, it only worked
Mm,
on half my body.
mhm.
And so half of me felt numb, and the other half felt like my hip was being ripped off. And I was like, what? And then I
Yeah.
had my second birth, and the same thing happened. And I was like, what? So I
Mm,
kind of had in my mind, like, I'm going to have to find something different because there's no, pain medications for me that really help. When my husband and I were expecting our third, we didn't have insurance. And so we were like, we need to find another cheaper option. And my sister had had some home births, but I was like, not ready for that.
mhm.
So we found a birth center, and we went with the birth center, and I had 4 births there. And then I learned about pain free birth. And this woman that taught the course, she was like, you can have the birth of your dreams, but you have to get rid of fear. And all my fears were most my worst fear was that I would have a baby on the side of the road at 40 below because I lived in Alaska and my baby was due in January. And I was like, I, I have babies fast, like
Yeah.
sometimes an hour and a half, you know?
Mm.
And I lived an hour away from the birth center. And so I tried to talk my midwives at the birth center into doing a home birth for me. And they were like, no, we don't do that. You're too far away. So I found another midwife who was willing to come out to my house. And I was like, okay,
Mm.
I can have a home birth that's pain free if I'm not having to fear like having a baby on the side of the road
Yeah.
in the freezing cold. And so that's kind of where like I wasn't planning on a home birth, but
Mm.
that's what it turned into because I was like, well, if I really want it to be pain free, I need to clear this fear. And it was stuck. Like
Yeah.
there's no way to do this. So it turned into home birthing. And after my first home birth that was pain free, I was like, oh my gosh, why would I do anything else?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. I feel like it's very different from a lot of other women's kind of journey into home birth, which is really cool. It's kind of like you were called there, and that's really awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I
Mm.
was into like I said, I wanted to do a natural birth with my very first one, but I didn't realize like if you just pick any old provider
Mhm.
and you go to a hospital, you're not going to have a natural birth.
Yeah.
You have to do a lot more study than that. So once I started working with midwives, they had me reading, Ina May Gaskin's books and all of that kind of stuff. And then I really got more into the natural side of things. Like what I thought was a natural birth was just don't take drugs when you're at the hospital, right?
Yeah.
But then since then, like, oh my gosh, that's totally not how I view a natural pain-free home birth, like totally a different thing than what I first envisioned of a natural birth.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was like kind of a weird way to get into it, but it felt so much better. My first birth at the birth center was like I got to the birth center and 10 minutes later the baby was out. Like I didn't e-
Mm.
I they turned the water, it was going to be a water birth. They turned it right
Yeah.
off. Like it was just coming out and I was like that was so easy and all my births were really pretty, they didn't have any issues really, so I wasn't afraid to do a home birth because I had really great pretty easy non-complicated births. So when
Yeah.
I decided to do a home birth, it was like, well, it'll be fine. I'm not worried
Mhm.
about complications.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. And so the home birth that you had, how did that go when labor started? Was that one fast as well, or like how did that one?
So yeah, my first home birth was pretty fast. It was like 2.5 hours or something. And I had gone to see my midwife the day before, or the night. He was born in the middle of the night. So like
Mhm.
just not too long before that in the afternoon. And she did our Vigo therapy. So she was doing like massage and stuff. And she's like, you are so ready. Like your hips are open, like you're so ready. And I was like, yeah, I can feel it. And I was a week overdue. Well, over my due date.
Yeah.
And so I felt like, yeah, okay, this is it. I had some spicy food. I came home, I went to sleep. I was having contractions, but they weren't like really strong. So I went to sleep and at 2:30 in the morning or somewhere around there, I woke up and I was like, okay, these are not going away. So I woke up my husband and he filled the tub and I just labored in the tub until my midwife got there, just saying affirmations and breathing. And I remember being really hot, like suddenly just like, I need a fan. Like it's really hot. And besides that, just like feeling sensations, but they weren't registering as pain because I wasn't resisting them. And
Mhm.
that was the first time that I had not resisted and fought them. Every other time was like, oh no, this hurts. And like resisting. Instead, I was just thinking surrender, open, relax, and saying affirmations and singing hymns. Be Thou My Vision was like a hymn that kept running through my mind and just envisioning my little baby
Mhm.
and having it in my arms. And within, yeah, by 5 o'clock in the morning, the baby was born and everything went really well. And I was like, what? Like,
Mhm.
that was amazing. There were no complications. Like, everything was so good.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was great.
Wow. That's awesome. Did you know from that point that you were only going to have home births from then on, or did you kind of still kind of think
Yeah, it
about it?
was okay. I'm not going back to a birth center or whatever, because it was nice. Like the birth center's nice because they clean up for you and all of that stuff. And like our midwives were great. They would cook us a little breakfast and things. Like it was kind of nice to be pampered. But it was also so nice to have my kids there to watch. So
Yeah.
my six older kids were able to watch their baby brother be born
Mhm.
and they thought it was really cool and I was like, yeah, I like this. I really like this. So with my next baby, he was born in 2020. So I
Okay.
really wanted nothing to do with any kind of clinic or hospital or birth center or anything. I didn't want to have to be wearing a mask or something. So I
Yeah.
was like, definitely having a home birth with that baby. My husband and the midwife like kind of clashed. She just like, I don't know, bossed him around and acted like men are always like this. And he was like, I don't like how she belittles me. And I
Mhm.
was like, yeah, I know. And she kept talking about like, well, you're a geriatric pregnancy, so you might hemorrhage. But I had specifically written into my birth plan nothing about hemorrhaging, that my bleeding would be fine. And so I was like, I don't know if I want her there during the birth. So I purposely called her. So she showed up like after the baby was born. So that was an unassisted home birth.
Okay.
Um, and that my husband caught the baby. Again, everything was totally fine. It was
Mhm.
great. But she was there to check APGAR scores and, cut the cord and check the placenta and all of that, which I don't know. I'm like, I like them to do that. It's kind of
Yeah.
nice to have someone else. And then with my twins, everybody told me, you're crazy. You cannot have a home birth with twins, especially
Mhm.
monodi twins, because they're, two sacs, but one placenta. If the placenta detaches before the second baby comes out, like it's so dangerous. And I had been going to see a perinatologist just to make sure there was no twin to twin transfusion or anything. Everything was fine. I was like,
Mhm.
it's going to be fine. Like, I trust it's going to be fine. I called lots of midwives area. I'm in the Phoenix area and I found a midwife who was willing to work with me with twins. But once she found out they were monodi, she was like, oh, I'm not comfortable with that. So
Mhm.
I was like 20 weeks or something. And now I'm looking for a new midwife. And every hospital that I called was like, oh, no, you definitely have to be in an operating room, one person with you max. And I was like, oh, I just don't like that. It just doesn't feel like it doesn't feel necessary for my
Yeah.
births. And when I asked the paleontologists, given my birth history, because they had my chart and they could, they were asking me questions, what's the risk of, like me having issues? And they're like, oh, well, 90% of the time, a monodi birth that's vaginal is fine. Like there's no problems. And
Mhm.
given your birth history, like probably a 90% chance everything would go well. And I'm like, so I have like not a 10% chance, but maybe like a 1% chance of like problems. I'm just gonna go with it. It feels right. And I always try and follow my intuition. Like I'm
Yeah.
not a kind of person who's like, oh, I will die rather than go to a hospital. Like if I feel the need to go, I'll go.
Mhm.
But I'm not gonna go out of fear because someone else tells me you can't do this.
Yeah.
And that perinatologist wagged his finger at me and said, don't you try and have these babies at home. And I hadn't even said I was planning it. I just said that I had two previous home births. And so he was
Yeah.
like, don't even think about it. I'm like, well, I am. I am thinking about it. And
Yeah.
I finally found like a birth attendant. So she wasn't a midwife, but she's a birth attendant. She's trained as a midwife, but not registered as a midwife.
Mhm.
And so I felt really confident with her, and she worked with a couple other ladies that were midwives. And so I had like a team of three and my husband and my mom. And I was like, okay, I feel totally confident having these babies at home. And again, it was amazing. It was pain free. I had the first twin, Frank Breech,
Mm.
and it was the easiest birth of all of my births. Like he just
Wow.
slid out butt first, like no tearing, nothing. It was just like pop, one push, and his whole body was out. And I was like, what was that? Like that was amazing. And then his brother came next, and he was head first. Like he had been transverse, but he flipped and came down, which was, kind of what I expected would happen.
Yeah.
And he came out like in two pushes, but he got a little bit stuck, like not really stuck, but like he came out and then I, kind of sucked back, right? Like they kind of do that. And then another big push and he was out. And I was like, wow, like head first was way more uncomfortable than butt first. Like that I didn't realize like it was so much more comfortable to have the baby Frank breech. And not like I think, that's the safest position, but it it was the most comfortable position for me for that birth. And I'm like, okay, so I'm not afraid of breech birth. Like I was a little
Yeah.
hesitant. The midwives were like, I think he might have turned, and he had been at my like 36-week ultrasound, he had been perfect. And then when I was in labor, I don't know if he turned or if he turned before, but they had felt my belly and they're like, I think he's head first. But when his butt came out, they're like, that's not a head.
Yeah.
It was so peaceful. It was so calm. It was so loving. And I don't have a problem with anybody roaring or grunting or being loud in birth, but I'm just really silent. Like I
Mm.
don't hardly make any noise.
Mhm.
I might like hum a little bit and sing and, breathe deep. Um, I do like the ocean breathing where I'm like just kind of shoving all the air back down my throat, which helps to open all your sphincters. But I just don't make a lot of noise. And so
Yeah.
everyone's like, oh my gosh, you could have heard a pin drop. It was so calm. It was so quiet. And all my kids were able to come watch right as I was pushing the babies out. They came and it was just like, this is so amazing. And it was really just, yeah, like, why would I go back? It was
Mhm.
amazing.
Wow. Was the twin birth also very fast? How long was that one?
That one was a little longer actually because
Okay.
my water broke and my water had never broken before. All my
Mm.
births, like, well, my first two, they broke my water, right? And then all my other births, my water broke as I was pushing the baby out. Like my
Mm.
third birth, that was really super fast, that I just got to the birth center and he came out. He was born in the call, like, yeah, my water was, I don't know, it sort of broke as he was coming out.
Yeah.
And my husband thought we had an alien baby because he was like, what is that thing? And the midwife just, reached and pulled it off. And he was like, oh, okay, normal child. But so my water broke at like 2 something in the morning. And I called my midwife and I was like, okay, I think you should come over. And she's like, are you having contractions? I'm like, no, but my water broke. And she's like, call me when you have contractions. I'm like, okay. And I'm thinking, yeah, yeah, I know this. Like, what's wrong with me? But that just threw me for a loop because I'd never had that happen.
Yeah.
And so, like 3 hours later, like I just kind of cleaned up and went back to bed. And about 3 hours later, I was starting to have really consistent contractions. So I called them. They got here about 6 o'clock.
Mhm.
And then the babies were born at like 10. So it was a
Okay.
longer birth, 5 6 hours, but not long by any means. Like
Yeah.
there's my favor was 26 hours.
Mhm.
So that was really short. And it was so peaceful and calm that it was like, it didn't feel like a long time.
Mm.
I think it felt like, okay, this is moving along and progressing really well. Like, not, it didn't feel fast, but it just didn't feel like, oh, are they coming or what?
Yeah. Definitely.
So I
That's
will say when
awesome.
I got to transition, that was funny because every time I get to transition, even though I know what transition is, it's happened multiple times. I've had 9 births.
Mhm.
Um, I start to think, I can't do this. This is too hard. I don't even know if I'm in labor. Maybe the baby's not coming. Like all these ridiculous thoughts, like, um, hello, your water already broke. You've been having contractions. Like, of course you're in labor, right?
Yeah.
And then, but with the twins, as soon as I started having those thoughts, I was like, this is transition.
Mhm.
Yay! Like, that's probably 15 or 20 minutes and the babies will be out. Okay, like, great, I can do this. And
Ye
and it was just a little bit after that, the baby, I was ready to push. So I think it's funny because I've seen so many times with friends and in online groups people talking about transition and right before they hit transition thinking I can't do this anymore, I'm done,
Mhm.
I need an epidural, I need drugs, something like I'm never going to make it through, and then bam, they're having the baby. So
Yeah.
it's
Mhm.
it's good to understand, like, okay, I'm doubting myself, I must be in transition.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I feel like is hard for women during labor to remember because they're so like in a different headspace than when they're just not in labor. And it's like they're in labor land, like people call it. And you just don't think about the reality of like, oh, this is probably transition. And it's
Yeah,
hard to like realize that when you're in it. So, yeah, definitely when you can realize it, it's very helpful because you kind of do ground yourself back and you're like, okay, I'm almost there. Like I could see the finish
yeah,
line now. Hmm.
yeah. And that was the first time in a birth that I recognized I was in transition, right?
Mm.
All my other births, like I was in transition and I was doubting myself and all of that, but it didn't hit me like, hey, you're doubting yourself. This is transition, right? I was just like, I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
this is getting kind of hard. Um, but with that birth, it like clicked, it registered, and I was like, I know this one.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I think it's good if you can have a midwife, a doula, your husband, somebody who's on your birth team
Hmm.
who recognizes that, right?
Yeah.
Hey, they're getting kind of antsy, they're doubting, they're feeling exhausted, they think they're done. We're almost there.
Yeah.
And to remind them, hey, you're almost there. You can do this.
Hmm. Yeah, that's definitely very helpful, especially for the women who can't kind of pinpoint that that's what they're going through. It would help to have somebody kind of tell you, like, hey, let's come back down to reality really quick. You're almost there.
Yeah, for sure.
Definitely. That's amazing. Your stories are just all so like different from each other, but each one of them are all so special too. So it's really cool to hear like all the differences between all of them. What do you think was the one thing that helped you have such like calm, peaceful births?
I think the most important thing was knowledge and faith.
Okay.
So understanding what my body was doing
Mhm.
every step of the way. Like I had read, Ina May's book. I had read other home birth books. Um, I don't know. I've read a lot of birthing books, right? And
Mhm.
just watched a lot of videos, watched mammals birthing, elephants, cats, deer, horses, whatever. Like they
Mhm.
all birth very similarly. And
Yes.
I was like, okay, if they can just lay down or stand and just calmly like move around, change positions, breathe, and let the baby out, you don't see them screaming and writhing in pain and freaking out and hyperventilating. They just calmly like let their body take over and do
Mhm.
what it needs to do. And so knowing that and studying that and like, oh, okay, this feels like I'm being torn apart inside. No, that's my cervix opening,
Mhm.
feeling, oh my gosh, this squeezing, this pressure. Okay, that's my uterus contracting, right? Knowing that and understanding that helped me to not resist it and not fight it and to just lean into it, surrender to it, and let my body do what my body was created to do.
Mhm.
And then trusting that God was going to get me through. And if it was my time to go, okay, well, and I did everything that I knew how to do and I'd be fine.
Yeah.
So just having that faith and that knowledge combined, because that's where I think I went wrong with my first births is I had wishful thinking
Mm.
instead of faith,
Mhm.
where I just thought it would be nice to just go to the hospital and have this birth and I won't need any meds and it'll be fine. And I didn't take any classes. I didn't read anything about birth. I didn't study any breathing techniques or anything. I just like,
Mhm.
I can do this. I've heard other people can do it, so I can.
Yeah.
And it was wishful thinking. It wasn't faith. It wasn't knowledge. So
Mhm.
as soon as I start feeling things that don't feel comfortable, that feel different, my body's never experienced before, I started freaking out.
Mhm.
Like, which is pretty typical.
Yeah.
Most women just that's how their labor progresses is they're like, oh my gosh. And of course I had Pitocin. So that's completely unnatural.
Mhm.
And you go from like, okay, here's some contractions to, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die.
Yeah.
And then, of course, well, I can't handle this. Something's wrong with me. I don't know how women did this in the past. I need drugs, like all of that. So, yeah, it was all just like sort of a lack of understanding how
Mhm.
the body works, how the medical system works, how, the process of birth versus my home births. I knew all of that. I'd studied that.
Yeah.
I learned that. I'd experienced that. And I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be fine. And I didn't have to fight or resist and fear. And so my body didn't register the sensations as a problem, as
Mhm.
pain. So it was like, sure, I felt everything. It's not because people will ask, like, well, is a pain free birth? Are you just lying and telling yourself this doesn't hurt? Or like, are you, or are you just like numb and you don't feel anything? And I think you can kind of do that with hypnobirthing, but the way I pain free birth isn't hypnobirthing because I'm totally there. I'm not
Mhm.
checked out. I'm not like in a different, I mean, you zone out, but you know what I mean? Like I'm fully surrendering to each sensation and feeling it,
Yeah.
but it's not registering as dangerous as painful because pain is a construct of your mind telling you there's something wrong. You need to do something because
Yeah.
this isn't supposed to happen, right? But if you told yourself, this is fine, this is what's supposed to happen, this is what my body does, I'm just birthing a baby, then your brain is like, oh, okay. And it turns off those signals of pain. And then you
Mhm.
can birth without fear and without pain. So, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
I think that was the biggest difference was having that knowledge and then combining that with faith.
Mhm. Yeah. I love how you talked about the whole like the fear kind of brings in that pain and it just like keeps going, which is that like fear, tension, pain cycle that we hear about. And that really is true. Like if you keep having all of these fears come in, your body's going to tense up. You're not going to just let the contractions come. You're not going to be able to surrender to it because you're kind of bracing for it and not wanting it to come. And that just makes it more painful. And then you keep getting more scared. So it's a cycle that keeps going on and on. And then our natural instinct is to go into fight or flight mode. So obviously, that kicks in too, and it just makes the pain worse and the birth experience worse. So, yeah, definitely kind of acknowledging those fears and then understanding everything that's happening. Like you said,
Yeah.
the contractions are not there for pain to make you hurt, to make you feel all of this bad.
Right.
that's going on. Like, that's not what their purpose is. Their purpose is to get the baby out. And if you kind of know what everything's doing, why everything's doing
Yeah.
what it's doing in the first place, you can kind of come to that realization and be like, okay, there's a purpose to all of this.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of people who attempt a pain-free birth, they don't address all of their fears because they think I'm only supposed to think about the positive. Like I can
Mm,
only think about rainbows and roses and all the good things. So
yeah.
anytime that that a fear comes to their mind, they suppress it and they like, oh, I can't think about that. That's
Hmm.
not going to happen. But then when they're in birth, they haven't addressed that. So their mind is like still trying to bring it back up. Like, okay, well, what if the baby doesn't come out? What if the baby gets stuck? What if, there's what if blah, 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 blah. So they start thinking all the what ifs and they start going crazy, like, oh, I don't know. And then the pain comes in because they're afraid. And if
Yeah.
you have addressed all of that before, like, okay, well, if this happens, then I'll do this. If this happens, then I'll do that, right? You think that all through. Worst case scenario, worst case scenario, I die. Or worst case scenario, I'm transferred to the hospital, baby's in the NICU for several weeks or months, like you think it through. And then, okay, and I would still have these things and it would still be okay. And you have to just kind of like turn that alarm off because
Hmm.
if you just push snooze, it's going to keep turning on every time. Like,
Yeah.
you haven't addressed me. You haven't addressed me. I'm still afraid of this.
Hmm.
And then it comes up in your labor, in
Yeah.
your birth, right?
Hmm.
It's going to come up. It's going to need to be addressed. So if you can address it before, then you're like, oh, no, that's fine. Like, I'm not worried about that. I know where the closest hospital is. I know, I can call 911. There's a fire station just around the corner, whatever. Like, you don't have to think that that's going to happen, but you have to be able to like have that backup plan
Hmm.
so that you can just totally relax and like, no, I don't have to worry about that. And you can focus on what you do actually want.
Yeah, definitely. I love that analogy that you kind of said of it just being like a reminder and you hit snooze. That's exactly what it is because it will all come back just like flooding in your mind during your labor. And because you're in such a vulnerable space during labor and not really in your right headspace, it's not going to be as easy to push those back during labor. It's going to be harder to do that and to suppress them. And so they will kind of take over your mind. And that's why a lot of transfers do happen, is because the woman ended up scared and is feeling like she can't do it anymore because all of that came back to her mind.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. And like to tell yourself, like, a transfer is not the end of the world. Like, that's
Hmm.
okay. That's what hospitals are there for. Like,
Yeah.
they may be overused for birth, but there is a reason, And I've
Hmm.
had lots of friends and family members who have had babies with heart conditions or whatever, and like that's the best, safest place for them to be born is there in the
Yeah.
hospital. But so I don't have to like freak out or like I'm a failure because I didn't get my home birth. Like if I
Hmm.
can turn all of that off,
Yeah.
then I probably will get my home birth, right?
Hmm.
But if I'm scared of that, if that's like my worst fear
Yeah.
and I haven't addressed it, yeah, I'm more likely to be transferred. I'm more
Mm.
likely to have a failed home birth or whatever
Yeah.
because that's what I'm like actually focusing on. My subconscious mind is actually thinking about the worst case scenario that I haven't addressed yet that I'm really afraid of happening.
Hmm.
It's like, when you're skiing or when you're driving, like, look at the road, look at the trail, not at the tree, not at the fence, right? Like, don't look at the guardrail or you're going to drive into it. And
Yeah.
if you are focused on, like, this is the birth, this is how it's going to go, that's what's going to happen. But if you're like secretly thinking about, what if I get transferred? What if
Yeah.
what if the baby dies? What if I have like, then those things are more likely to
Hmm.
occur in your birth.
Yeah. Definitely. I really loved everything that we talked about right now. I feel like it was all such good advice for women who are listening and planning a home birth. It's just all so helpful to hear things like this that can really help them prepare for their home birth. So I really appreciate you talking about all of that.
Thank you.
Yeah. If anyone wants to kind of connect with you, are you on social media at all?
So I am on Instagram at the Healthified Mother. I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook group you can request to join, also called the Healthified Mother. And it's like a support group for my book, What to Create When You're Creating. And then TikTok, same thing, Kristi Dugan or the Healthified Mother. And I have a YouTube channel. So they can follow me in all the places, either Kristi Dugan or the Healthified Mother. Most of them are both. And yeah, lots of content there, mostly short clips and videos, but I do have
Mhm.
some podcasts, some longer videos and things they can kind of follow some of my journey.
Yeah. And what do you share on that page, The Healthified Mother?
So in the Healthified Mother Facebook group, that's kind of like a support group for anybody who has questions, what do I do when this happens? Hey, my baby has a rash, like any of that kind of stuff. Or I'm really nervous. I've been thinking about, doing this or whatever. Talk me through it. My
Mhm.
my midwife wants me to, do this or be induced or any that kind of stuff, right? Then answers to questions, support, sharing information. And then my other pages like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, all of that is just kind of sharing tidbits of information, stuff that's in my book. And like, you can do this.
Mhm.
Anyone can do this. And yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll go ahead and have all of the links down below. So if anyone wants to find you on any of those platforms, they can easily find those in the show notes. And if you wanted to talk a little bit about your book and just tell us kind of what it's about and anything else you have about it, you could do that.
Sure. So I gave away all of my copies. I need to order more. So this one has a band across it saying not for sale because it's my whatever proof copy. But it's called What to Create When You're Creating, a guide to experiencing a pleasurable pregnancy and birth.
Okay.
And it just goes through, it starts with my story and like how I got into birthing and stuff. And then it has each chapter goes through like why you can have a home birth or a pain-free birth, how it's possible wherever you choose, hospital, birth center, home, on the top of a mountain, it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
It's how you birth, not where you birth, right?
Mhm.
And then choosing your birth team, how to find out what kind of birth you want, and then choose a team that's going to support that. Clearing traumas, clearing limiting beliefs, letting go of all of the past birth trauma, even your own birth if you've never had a baby yet, the nutrition and movement and each trimester and how that kind of proceeds. And different than this is what you can expect, this is what you get to create. How to write a
Mhm.
birth plan, how to write a pregnancy plan, because how your pregnancy goes is how your birth usually goes. So if you just start thinking about how you want your birth to go at the end of your pregnancy, it's less likely to go that way if you haven't started at the very beginning with
Mhm.
planning and prepping your body all the way through. And then the last chapter is about, well, it talks about labor and how that progresses, all the stages, what to do, how to have a pain free birth, like the mindset stuff. And then the last chapter talks about postpartum care and rest and like what to do if baby has jaundice, what to, all of those like tips and things. So it's kind of a resource.
Right.
It's pretty thick, like 400 pages, but
Mhm.
it's also on Audible. So you can listen to
Okay.
it, but I think it's great to have as a resource because you're going to want to flip through and be like, oh yeah, I have a yeast infection. What do I do about it? Like,
Mhm.
oh, my baby is, showing some symptoms of fever or something. What should I do?
Yeah.
And it's just like a resource there. So yeah.
Definitely. That's awesome. I really love hearing that you incorporated kind of all of the stages from pregnancy all the way through postpartum. I feel like a lot of books that kind of do talk about what you're saying as like resources is usually this book is only pregnancy or this book is only about birth or just postpartum. And so kind of having one where you have all of it inside one book is really nice to have on hand.
Yeah, I feel like it's a great resource. Like, I wish this book was written when I first learned about
Mhm.
births. And that's kind of what I wrote is like everything I wish I would have known or someone would have told me
Yeah.
before. And I read a lot of books to get that information and I watched a lot of videos and went through
Mhm.
9 births and like I'm just gonna condense this into one book
Yeah.
so that people don't have to read. I mean, it's great. Go read as much as you want. I think that's fantastic. But if you're like
Mhm.
not a reader, you're like, give me the one book. Like,
Mhm.
here.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And where can the book be purchased? Is it on like Amazon or where can it be found?
Yeah. So you can get it on Amazon in Kindle version, audio, or paperback.
Okay, cool. So I'll also have that link down below for anyone who's interested in buying that book as well. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really
Yeah.
appreciated you.
Thank you. It's been fun watching your videos, watching your journey, and like, yes, yes, yes. Like
Mhm.
we're on the same page. And I enjoy connecting with other women who are promoting birth in a wholesome, sacred, natural way that's,
Mhm.
like this is how birth was meant to be.
Yeah,
So I'm so
absolutely.
impressed with what you've been sharing.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That was such a good conversation that we got to have with Kristi today. I so appreciate all of her wisdom that she shared with us and all of the advice and tips that she gave for all the women who are currently planning their home birth. So definitely go ahead and check out her pages, check out her social medias, and also her book as well. Like I said, they will all be linked down below, so make sure you check all of that out. If you are currently planning and preparing for a home birth, then I'd love to share with you more information about the Empowered Home Birth course. This is a home birth based birth course, and inside this 8-week program, you will receive educational videos and weekly emails filled with additional resources for you to prepare for your empowering home birth. Once you purchase the course, you also get perks such as access to my entire resource library and private community chats. To enroll, click the link in the show notes and get started on the journey to your empowered home birth. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to share with any family or friends who may benefit from these empowering stories. Also, don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and review to help others who are searching for this information find this podcast. I'll see you next week for another empowering home birth story.